I'm the treasurer of the Campaigning Against Climate Change Trade Union Group. I'm also one of the joint trade union representatives for the North of England for Extinction Rebellion, and I think it's really interesting that the environmental movement is increasingly looking towards the trade union movement around the question of action, campaigning and protest on these questions. I'm going to start again just briefly where the school students also started, which is what's happening around the world in the context of climate change. Someone's mentioned the Amazon fires that have hit the headlines over the summer, and the criticism that's been thrown at Bolsonaro for his inaction on that. Though I also think many of those governments that were criticising Bolsonaro also have many failures on their plate when it comes to the environment. I think today we've started to see the first news reports from communities in the Bahamas impacted by Hurricane Dorian, and it's shocking, the scale of the destruction, particularly slow but particularly intense hurricane, decimating some of the poorest communities, and the response of Donald Trump, of course, is to fiddle around with a Sharpie pen and try and over-egg his own role within that. And of course, the other big news environmentally, though it won't make the headlines in the way that the hurricanes will, is the news from Iceland, where scientists over this summer, Greenland, where scientists over this summer have measured truly terrifying levels of changes to the environment. One scientist quoted in the Guardian this afternoon says that the particular glacier he's focused on has decreased in depth by 9 metres just this summer as a result of global warming triggering ice melt. And I emphasise this, and I mention this because I think we have to start from the science and the reality of climate change. I've been doing the run to Climate Strike a whole number of talks to trade union groups and so on. I was recently asked to speak at a trades council, which will remain anonymous, but where the chair asked me not to talk about climate change, but to focus on the action. The problem with that approach is actually the scale of the action we require, the type of action we require, is determined by the threat we face to the environment. In Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, it's one of probably the best book on introductory book to climate change and its interactions with society. She points out that back when the United Nations first discussed climate change in one of their first environmental conferences back in 1992, the world only had to reduce its global emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases by 2% a year if it wanted to avert catastrophic climate change. It's a perfectly possible, gradual process that could have taken place over a period of a quarter of a century. Yet they failed to do that. In fact, exactly the opposite took place, as we know. And now the economies like Britain, America, generally in Europe, we need to reduce our emissions by 80 or 90% in a period of around a decade. And so this, I think, shapes our response. It's no longer enough, I think, for us, we're environmentalists, and few environmentalists do actually, I think, anymore, talk about the individual small-scale changes. Any politician who counterposes the idea of simply changing light bulbs or whatever to the scale of the environmental crisis, I think, should be rightly laughed out of town. And actually what is needed is really audacious, large-scale, radical action that fundamentally challenges the priorities of the political and economic system that we live in, that challenges the big fossil fuel corporations, challenges the politicians that rule in their name. And I'm really pleased, really excited. I've been an environmental activist and a socialist for 25, 30 years, and this is the most exciting period I've ever been in. It's the most terrifying period, but also I'm so inspired by the response of young people and organisations like the UK SCN and Earthstrike and the Extinction Rebellion, because what they've done is to put the question of mass political action, mass action on the streets, civil disobedience, direct action, mass protests, mass movements on the agenda as part of the solution to environmental crisis. And then it really poses a challenge to us as trade unionists, doesn't it? What are we doing? What are we going to do, and how are we going to match that? And here I think we have a golden opportunity. September the 20th, the call for adults to join the climate strike that Greta Thunberg put out after the inspirational school student strikes that have run for 8 months, I think has struck a real chord. I think there are thousands of people around the world, and tens of thousands of them, who would like to partake, who think that they will do something on that day, who want to show that they're in solidarity with the school students. And I think our job as activists and as trade unionists is to encourage that as much as possible and let 1,000 flowers bloom. There are of course, the bureaucratic side of it, that we have to get our trade union branches, our regions, our conferences, our national unions and so on to back and support that strike. Stuart mentioned the UCU's motion to the TUC conference, which is due to happen towards the end of this month. That calls, it's a very positive motion, and it calls for a 30-minute stoppage. It's quite a radical motion. Unfortunately, an amendment has been put to it by the ASLEF, which I think is very disappointing. It calls, and I'll look at the exact text for it. It calls, instead of for a 30-minute stoppage, it calls for a 30-minute working campaign action to coincide with the global student strike. That would, of course, be a great thing if the TUC did do that, but that's not enough. It's not anywhere near as audacious or radical or as upping the ante as what is needed. And I hope that amendment is defeated, and I hope that the original motion, which calls for the TUC to put on a 30-minute strike in solidarity and a 30-minute work stoppage in solidarity, does go forward. But irrespective of that, I think that there are hundreds of workplaces that will do something on the day. Interestingly, and I think it's a reflection of where the trade union movement in general is when it comes to this question, there are lots of workplaces where things are beginning to happen in conjunction with management. Now, as a socialist, that's not necessarily my starting point, but I do think it's interesting that particularly in the public sector, in local government, and to a lesser extent in higher education, there are a number of establishments who have given a permission or have allowed workers to take part in the strikes, giving them unpaid time off or allowing them to take extended lunch breaks, or indeed even saying that they won't victimise people who take part. I think this is a very good development. I think we should push for that to happen in more places. I think if it happens in a lot of places, that's a good step forward. I think those councils who have done things like declare climate emergencies should be held to account for doing that. What does that really mean in practice? Are you really going to challenge anyone who walks out to join a school student protest? Are you really going to cause problems around those questions? And places like Lambeth and Brighton councils have tried to do that quite positively. I also know of lots of little examples. There's where I live in Manchester, there's an engineering firm that repairs elevators where management has said to their workers, you can join the strikes, you can go on the protest, will you please wear a t-shirt with our logo on it saying that we support the strikes. Interestingly, even at that point, the trade union said, no, we don't want to take part in that if you're going to make that as a condition. But I think it's interesting and it's indicative that this is happening around the country. It's not enough though, and I think for us September the 20th, and I think the students are right when they emphasise that September the 20th is the beginning of a process, it's not the end. We're not going to stop climate change, and we're not going to force action simply by what takes place on September the 20th. This is the beginning of a process, and we need to use the event to give our members, our trade union branches, our workers, and our comrades confidence that they can do stuff in the future. And I think there's great importance to this. I think for two reasons we have to see the trade union movement going forward as absolutely central to that. The first of which, of course, is the power of workers when they do move. The ability of workers to stop industry, the ability of workers to force the government into capitulation, the ability to win demands off governments if workers act in unions, in united forms and fight. And that's important. We want the trade union movement to be part of demanding real change and real action on climate change. That basic demands that can improve our members' lives and the lives of our people in our communities, but we'll also have improvements to the environment, the nationalisation of the railways, for instance, the installation of homes on an enormous scale, the use of renewable energy over fossil fuel-based power sources. All that stuff, I think, is tremendously important, and the trade union movement is uniquely placed, I think, to force that. The second thing out, though, is that the role of trade unions has a different aspect to it as well, which is that actually we're uniquely placed to think about how we can redesign our workplaces, our communities, and our economies along sustainable lines. If we are to get a zero carbon future, if we are to, for instance, win the demand that Extinction Rebellion called for a zero carbon Britain by 2025, then actually that will require quite radical transformations about how we live our lives, types of our workplaces, the types of industries we work in, and so on. And trade unions should be at the centre of redesigning and rebuilding and radically thinking about how those can be done differently. In the campaigning against climate change, we've begun that process, we think, with the 1 million climate jobs report. The Green New Deal is another aspect of this, but we will need more of this and more strategies and more plans. I suppose I'll finish up by re-emphasising my central point, that September the 20th has to be a day when the trade union movement begins the process of taking to the streets in solidarity with the school students. We have to say to those school students that we are absolutely in solidarity with what you do, that we are inspired by you, but we also have to start showing that we want to be absolutely part of this. And in some places that will mean groups of workers doing small things, coming out of their offices at lunchtime and maybe having a little protest outside, or maybe organising a meeting or inviting a speaker in. But really we want to be using this that starts to have a vision that we will have really radical mass protests in the future over this question. So September the 20th is tremendously important. It's the start, it's not the end, but I'm enormously hopeful. As I said, I've been an activist in the environmental movement for many, many years, and this is the first time I've really got a sense of the trade union movement as a whole starting to take seriously the question of action and protest on climate change. It's no longer just rhetoric, it is about starting the process, and we, I think, as activists need to accelerate that and encourage that as much as possible. So thank you very much for your time and your invitation.
Okay. I'll take a few questions now. Mary?
I just want the specific details of the demonstration.
In Birmingham? Yes.
Is it in Birmingham?
Well, on the 20th there's lots. What will be the details on Birmingham?
Nationally, it happens all over the nation. However, in Birmingham, it's at 11 a.m. at Victoria Square.
Thank you.
We go outside. Yeah, outside. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
Two issues that concern me about climate change is, one is the nature of throwaway society we've got, where many goods are made in China, where there's very poor trade, there's basically no trade union recognition, poor treatment of workers. We need to ask, why are we importing goods from China where people treated appallingly? Why are we allowing such a major country to get away with absolute decimation of the climate through their mass industry that they've built up? Second issue is public transport as well, is to try and get people onto public transport so that we're less reliant on the car, so we can move away from a car-centric society and actually say to ourselves, well, instead of the rich and the wealthy with their Jaguars or their Rolls Royces going around polluting the environment, we can get people onto electric buses, electric trams, electric trains, and make a real transition away from mass motor cars being used to the point where we're choking up our city, we're stifling growth and job creation, and we're basically creating a two-tier society where those who seem to have cars are the ones who make it, and the ones who have and the ones who don't have them. And I don't think that's fair or right, and I actually think that's quite backward in the modern society, so I think that's something we need to seriously address.
Michael?
Yes. Probably this might be a bit of a 360, because I live live on a council estate. Now, when it's all well and good, I keep thinking about these things that people want these sort of climate change and all this sort of fancy stuff. But if you can't afford to get into town, if you're living on the breadline, what is climate change to you? It's about making sure your kids are fed, making sure your home's warm. The message is, to me, is all well and good, but there has to be some sort of process or structure where you're talking to what I would say ordinary people, but the people who are disconnected, people that don't come to these sort of meetings, because that's the only way you're going to get the full buy-in. And obviously, there are people in these sort of dodgy jobs, short-term jobs. You imagine if they went out and went out on climate strike or whatever, they probably potentially would be out of a job. So I think this is quite important, but we also must remember it's just not the connected people, it's everybody who needs to get some sort of way, or how these young people can get that message out to people who necessarily don't get it, because they're just looking for a solution to make sure that their kids are warm or their houses are warm. So that's one way. But I would also say, are you interviewing a political party? Because at the end of the day, it's your activism. You have the power to make choices, to vote who you want. So you need to join a political party, you need to join the trade union. So that's the only way you're going to change, because we're, a majority of us are probably a bit older than you, but it's you who are now the future, where we've got this sort of Brexit thing. So only you've got the power, you know, so get yourself politically active, join the trade union, and then make your choices, who to vote for, who to speak on the behalf to get this climate change. But yeah, the two speakers and you all were fantastic, so thanks for that.
Okay. Two others have indicated. Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Martin. The key thing is to get the trade union movement engaged in even limited practical actions. And I'm a member of the National Education Union, and discussion has been had about teachers actually at lunchtime, when they're not actually required to be in the school, to march around the schools and placards and have an open air meetings. Sort of various practical things like that. Given that you know, the Tory trade union laws are such that, you know, it's trade unions, unfortunately, I'm in favour of defying the trade union laws myself, but I'm not going to at the present stage defy them. I also think that we will, you know, people who are connected with regional bodies of the trade union, I think you want to think about getting Martin to come and speak. So I've already given an excellent presentation there of the need for the trade union to start acting on this. And we are some limited actions have been taken, actually. A meeting took place on Tuesday night of a dozen local trade unionists, and we've established at the Unison office, with the support of Birmingham Unison, a campaign against climate change trade union committee based in Birmingham, so that we can actually start agitating the Birmingham trade union movement on this. And the next meeting is October the 1st, 6:30 at the Unison offices at 19th floor at McLaren Tower. I also agree with Michael's point about politics. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has called for 1 million solar panels on all the council houses in the country. That's a sort of dramatic action that we need, you know. I mean, you can tell the things are moving. I mean, even this rotten Tory government yesterday said they were going to put 200 million extra in buses. And of course, transforming the transport system with buses, with more trains, is absolutely essential for, I'm just finishing it, for this. So I think the important thing is we start agitating for action in collaboration with the school students, and I think it's good that they are having trade union speakers at the meeting. But if people can make this meeting on the 1st of October to start continuing our agitation on this, that would be excellent.
Okay. And finally, Steve.
From Judge Strikes,
Yeah.
Marcus pointed out being on the council estate and what ticks people there. I live in some low-rise council blocks in Sheldon, six flats per block. Last year, the council announced they wanted to put insulation on the outside of these, not too dissimilar to what stuck to the outside of Brentford Tower. though they promised it won't burn this time. Yeah, big swear. Thing is, they wanted £4,000 from each resident to pay for it. And to do a block, everyone in that block had to agree. If one person said no, it didn't get done. Weirdly, amongst a bunch of people who are unemployed, minimum wage, or irregularly employed, there was at least one person in every block who said, sorry, I can't afford the £4,000. So, yeah, where do we go from here? I mean, it's got to be, I mean, yeah, Jeremy Corbyn's $1 million solar panels, right. If you can also, that can also be extended to proper insulation of those council houses and council flat. I mean, actually, the flats on, they need to be demolished. They were built in the 1940s, 1950s, and they weren't supposed to last past the 70s.
Yeah, do you want to?
Chair, rise to point of order, please. Try and question people who've got now. There must be a few of you. We've had two delegates to speak twice. And this chap's got his hand up for quite a while. I think you're going to be protocol and correct if you, with respect, allow him to speak.
Right, okay.
Yeah, very short. I travel, cycle across town, having one very early on, and what I see things need to be changed. There's hundreds of cars going into town with only one person, the driver, constantly, and that should be stopped. They can be, I think it should be a law to make them pick people up. The car should be told before they start off. Single-use cars should not be allowed in around the city centre. And you can pick people up and drop them off at the rail station if you live out in Sheldon, places like that. You've got to change our attitudes towards transport and these cars. And all these cars coming into the city centre now, all the exhaust fumes are being concentrated. And you don't want to do what they do in London now, because the very, very rich can drive into the centre of London, but the people from the suburbs can't. You do need to town transport.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, lots there to do. I'll try and address those in turn. Look, I think the starting point is absolutely the way that climate change is a social justice issue.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good luck on September the 20th. I hope there's lots to turn out. Climate change is absolutely an issue of social justice. Working class people are more likely to suffer both the impacts of natural disaster and the ongoing impacts of environmental problems, pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and so on. And it's a disproportionate impact on communities of people of colour, of women, are more likely to suffer those consequences. And if the trade union movement is anything, it's a movement that should stand up against those injustices. I do think, however, that there's a view sometimes that say that working class people are only interested in bread and butter issues. They're only interested in housing or jobs or wages and so on. And of course, those are important for ordinary people. But actually, what's interesting is quite how, amongst working class people and amongst the population in general, the concern over questions of the environment have gone up dramatically since the big protests have started this year around climate change. And that's partly, I think, because people do care about the world that they live in. What's the most watched programme in 2016? It was Blue Planet 2. What did that lead to? It led to millions of people saying, we want to stop using plastics, or I want to try and recycle more. And actually, I think that what we have to try and do is to think about how do we make the question of action on environmental questions and action on climate change real for ordinary people, because the solutions will benefit the people. John is absolutely right. If you were to cut the number of cars going into the city centre of Birmingham and replace them with electric trams or buses or whatever, actually working class kids wouldn't die or get lung disease or asthma or so on the scales that they do. If you were to think about dealing with youth unemployment in Birmingham, which I believe, according to the quick Google I've just done, is at 9%, which is about 4% higher than the national average. If you want to deal with that, well, let's create 500,000 jobs in the West Midlands for young people. Let's train them how to insulate homes, and let's create a massive process of insulating homes across the community, so everybody's homes are warmer, everybody has lower bills, and actually those young people have got decent jobs and decent salaries. That's what I think the government should do. It should tackle the question of climate change, reducing emissions, and it could start to solve the problem of unemployment and so on. And in that, we also have to then say, what is it about the society that we live in that won't do this? Why won't they? Why is it that we get a thing like a throwaway society where people, chuck things away, or that we rely on imports? And that's because the society that we live in is geared towards maximising profits for corporations, not for fulfilling people's needs. Just on the question though of production in China, it is notable that Chinese companies have driven emissions, but let's also be honest that what's happened really is that we've offset the emissions from UK industry and placed them elsewhere in the world. Many of those goods that are being manufactured are never going to be used in China, though the people who work in those communities are suffering the consequences of the pollution and the lack of union organisation and decent pay and so on. And those goods are being manufactured for Western economies. That's something that we should challenge, but we should also be honest that the British economy, as much as many of countries like America, has been disproportionately responsible for the environmental impact that we faced. Britain is responsible for 5.8% of global emissions historically. So since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Britain has created around 6% of all carbon emissions ever. So we have created a historic environmental debt to the rest of the planet as a result of our early industrialisation. And indeed, in the process of that, we've pillaged and we've stolen resources from the rest of the world that have impoverished them and lessened their ability to deal with the impacts of the environment. So I think Britain has a historical responsibility to act on the environment, to show leadership, to use a phrase that politicians would like, and to actually show that things can be done. I'll finish though with two quick points, Chair. The first of which I think one of the most influential moments in my political life was in 1999 when in Seattle there was an enormous protest against the World Trade Organization, and it was a protest that united loose organisations from people protesting against the trade deal, people protesting poverty, people protesting environmental inaction. And there was a key moment on the demonstrations as they barricaded Seattle and they tried to shut the conference down, when a big march of trade unionists from the Teamsters Union joined up and came together with young people protesting over environmental issues. And they called it the moment when the Turtles and the Teamsters came together, and the issues melded into one. And actually that's really, for me, what we need to start doing on September the 20th, and then looking forward, is to give a sense of a new movement that brings together those concerned about the environment and those concerned about workers and their lives and their work, and to meld them into a movement that's saying, actually, these two issues cannot be separated any longer. Our interests are together, and that's why I think it's important that we acknowledge the leadership of the of young people and the students and the Extinction Rebellion and so on, and say that's brilliant, and that actually we're now going to work together to make sure that vision comes true, because actually we've got a world to lose if we don't, and the future for not just our grandchildren or our children, but indeed ourselves and the communities today will be very, very bleak unless there's action immediately and quickly. So I do hope the Trades Council will make sure it will endeavour to do what it can to make sure that September 20th in Birmingham is a success, and that any future protests are also really good. Thank you very much.